This week we celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving, and according to World Population Review, some 7 out of 8 American families will consume turkey. It's well known in the United States that turkey was served at the first Thanksgiving in 1621 and has been the protein of choice for the holiday ever since. And like most of what we think we know about the prodigious poultry, that common story is, well, not necessarily true. In fact, you might be as surprised about the history of the big-breasted holiday centerpiece as you would be if your holiday turkey was stolen by the Bumpus's dogs. The turkey is a native bird of North America, whose preferred habitat is mixed conifer hardwood forests. Populations are often close to oak forest, as acorns are a favorite food, although they are omnivores, who eat all sorts of seeds and berries, as well as insects, spiders, caterpillars, snails, slugs, worms, and even small snakes and lizards. They are taxonomically classified as the genus Meleagris, which is confusingly the ancient Greek word for guinea fowl. While there are several species in the fossil record, only 2 species remain. The wild turkey, Meleagris galapavo, is common in the United States and parts of Canada and Mexico. To add more confusion, the species name galapavo is derived from the Latin words for rooster, gallo, and pavo, peacock. So the wild turkey is named, essentially, guinea fowl rooster peacock, even though it is none of the above. The other existing species is a slightly smaller and shorter-legged ocellated turkey, Meleagris ocellata, native to the Yucatan Peninsula. Ocellata is Latin for small eyes and doesn't refer to the bird's eyes, which are not notably smaller than those of its cousin Meleagris galapavo, but because of dots on the tail feathers that resemble eyes. If you've never seen an ocellated turkey, that isn't a surprise. While they are hunted by and a significant food source for certain ethnic groups that live in the Yucatan, they are rarely seen outside their native habitat because while they are easily domesticated, they do not breed in captivity. Currently, 6 subspecies of the wild turkey are recognized, although, interestingly, the subspecies Mexican wild turkey is now thought to be extinct, even though it is its descendants that you'll likely serve with gravy on Thursday. In fact, it was this subspecies that was likely the first to be domesticated, one of only a few domesticated animals in the New World. Exactly when is still in question. Writing in the open scientific journal PLOS One in 2012, a study led by Aaron Kennedy Thornton of Trent University, Ontario, Canada, notes that the discovery of the bones of M. galapavo in an ancient Mayan site in Guatemala, well out of the natural range of the bird, is evidence that the birds were part of Mesoamerican trade networks, suggesting capture and domestication as early as the 4th century BC, as much as 1,000 years earlier than previously thought. And an international team of researchers writing in the journal Royal Society Open Science in 2018 established that there was probably a thriving business in turkeys along the continent's fledgling trade routes. Moreover, the University of Colorado Arts and Sciences magazine notes analysis of DNA from turkey bones at archaeological sites and from modern samples of wild turkeys throughout their range indicate that domesticated birds in central Mexico and the domesticated birds from the southwest are distinctly different. Examining archaeological sites in Tennessee, in 2010, researchers at Florida State University, writing in the journal Archaeological Science Reports, that as early as 1200 to 1400 AD, Native Americans in the American Southeast were also managing and raising turkeys. So the domestication of turkeys in the Americas appears to have developed relatively independently in at least 3 different domestication events. Florida State University News notes turkeys have been part of Native American life long before the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Researcher Tanya Perez, an associate professor of anthropology at Florida State University, was quoted in the Florida State University News. It appears Native Americans were favoring males for their bones for tools, and they certainly would have favored males for their feathers. They tend to be much brighter and more colorful than females of the species. Their feathers were used on arrows, in headdresses, and clothing. The meat was used for food. Their bones were used for tools, including scratchers used in ritual ceremonies. There are even representations of turkeys in artifacts from the time. An intricately engraved marine shell pendant found at a site in central Tennessee shows 2 turkeys facing each other. So at this point, it's probably appropriate to address the elephant-sized turkey in the room. How did a bird from North America that was domesticated by and important to the culture of Native Americans come to be called turkey? The Los Angeles Times wrote in 2010, the first Europeans to lay eyes on the bird we today call a turkey were likely Christopher Columbus and the crew of his 4th American voyage in 1502. They called the animal gallina de la tierra, or land chicken. That name is odd since both turkeys and chickens actually do fly, and as the contest goes, turkeys are generally better flyers than chickens, although neither is likely to win a prize at the Bird Olympics. These land chickens were an early part of the Columbian Exchange, with Spanish conquistadors finding them in Mexico. The website France Emerique explains the American fowl arrived in Europe aboard Spanish galleons in the early 16th century. Adopted as a rare and exotic food, turkey soon outshone peacock at prestigious dinners and delighted foodies with its tender, refined white flesh. In 1534, writer François Rabelais included a poulet d'Inde, literally a chicken from India, which is how turkey got the name dinde in French, on the menu of a feast he described in his novel Gargantua. 15 years later, 66 turkeys were served at a banquet organized by the city of Paris to celebrate the coronation of Queen Catherine de' Medici. Now, wait a tick. Chicken from India? Yes, Dictionary.com explains. The original word in French, coq d'Inde, meant rooster of India and has since shortened to dinde. Those names likely derive from the common misconception that India and the New World were one and the same. But how did the India bird that wasn't from India get to be called turkey? Well, that name originated in England. There are two different stories as to how that might have happened. One possibility is that the birds were first imported into England by merchants from the Mediterranean. These merchants traded goods from throughout the Mediterranean, including the Ottoman Empire. National Public Radio explained in 2008 the British weren't particularly precise about products arriving from the East. Persian carpets were called turkey rugs. India flour was called turkey flour. Hungarian carpet bags were called turkey bags. If a product came to London from the far side of the Danube, Londoners called it turkey. And that's what happened to the American bird. Thus, an American bird got the name turkey cock, which was then shortened to turkey. So the birds that came from North America, which the French thought was part of India, were imported by merchants who might or might not have been from the Ottoman Empire, and thus the English called the bird turkey. And if you were wondering, Dictionary.com explains that the Turkish word for a turkey is Hindi, which literally means Indian. The Indian website The Pioneer explains that since the Turks knew that this fowl was not theirs, they made a completely different mistake and called it Hindi. The alternative explanation also has to do with a bird not from Turkey. National Public Radio explains long before Christopher Columbus went to America, Europeans already had a wild fowl they liked to eat. It came from Guinea in Western Africa. It was a guinea fowl. It was eaten in London, so it got the nickname turkey cock because supposedly it came from Constantinople. The LA Times asked, was there some Turkish merchant who brought the animals to England, or were the English just atrocious with geography? When the North American birds started being brought by merchants, the Londoners noted the aesthetic similarity between the African bird and the North American bird, and the name carried across. Exactly when the bird arrived in England isn't clear. Some sources claim that Henry VIII, who ruled until 1547, was the first to eat turkey for Christmas dinner, while others contend that the bird was not imported into England until after his death. That brings up a particularly odd example of the Mandela effect. The website Very Well Mind explains that the Mandela effect refers to a situation in which a large mass of people believes that an event occurred when it did not. The term itself is named after former South African President Nelson Mandela, whom many people seem to recall having died in a South African prison in the 1980s, only to be surprised when, in 1990, he was released from prison very much alive, serving as president of South Africa and finally dying not in prison in 2013. In this case, the aptly named website debunkingmandelaeffects.com writes that many people seem to recall that Henry VIII is holding a giant turkey leg in a famous painting by German-Swiss painter Hans Holbein the Younger, painted in 1536. And because of this, popular depictions of Henry VIII tend to include the rotund roi munching a giant turkey leg. And the problem is that memory is wrong, and Henry VIII is instead merely holding a pair of gloves in the picture. Henry VIII aside, the LA Times explains that about 100 years after the New World turkey arrived in Europe, the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts, where they found an animal that bore a strong resemblance to the turkey that they knew from back home, although this wild variety did not take kindly to attempts at being domesticated. The English, who named the New World bird after turkey, came back to the New World and passed that name on to the native birds who, were they to speak English and care what we called them, might have been somewhat confused by the association. Still, the modern breeds that are used for consumption today are all actually derived from European birds that have been imported from Mexico, and are thus descendants of the Mexican wild turkey, a subspecies that is now extinct in the wild. But were there turkeys at the first Thanksgiving? Well, there's some debate about that, but probably not. Encyclopedia Britannica explains that there is indeed evidence of a meal shared between Pilgrim settlers at Plymouth Colony and Wampanoag people in late 1621, but there is no indication that turkey was served. For meat, the Wampanoag brought deer, and the Pilgrims provided wild fowl. Now, strictly speaking, that fowl could have been turkeys, which were native to the area, but historians think it was probably ducks or geese. Although Troy Bickham, a professor of history at Texas A&M University, explained in 2022, I do think it's possible that the Pilgrims ate turkey in 1621, and certainly was served at celebrations in New England throughout the colonial period. But that connection between Thanksgiving and turkeys wasn't really cemented until about 200 years later, and it has something to do with a famous sheep. Whether there was or wasn't turkey at the first Thanksgiving, Bickham argues that historians like me, who have studied the history of food, have found that most modern Thanksgiving traditions began in the mid-19th century, more than 2 centuries after the Pilgrims' first harvest celebration. The reinvention of the Pilgrim celebration as a national holiday was largely the work of Sarah Hale. Born in New Hampshire in 1784, as a young widow she published poetry to earn a living. Most notably, she wrote the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. In 1837, Hale became the editor of the popular magazine Godey's Ladies Book. Fiercely religious and family-focused, it crusaded for the creation of an annual national holiday of thanksgiving and praise, commemorating the Pilgrims' Thanksgiving feast. The San Bernardino Sun writes that in 1827, author Sarah Josephine Hale devoted a chapter of her novel Northwood, A Tale of New England, to describing her ideal version of a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. In the book, Hale writes, the roasted turkey took precedence on this occasion, being placed at the head of the table, and well did it become its lordly station. In September 1863, Hale wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, in which she argued, you may have observed that for some years past there has been an increasing interest felt in our land to have the Thanksgiving held on the same day, in all the states. It now needs national recognition and authoritative fixation only to become permanently an American custom and institution. Previously, days of Thanksgiving had been largely proclaimed by state governors, and the celebration varied. Hale's letter prompted Lincoln to proclaim the final Thursday of 1863 as a day of Thanksgiving. The holiday was signed into law by President Ulysses Grant in the 1870 Holiday Act. The tradition was again reinforced by a work of fiction. The Sun continues. The traditional image of a feast, complete with stuffed turkey and numerous other dishes, took root in 1889 when noted American author Jane G. Austen wrote a fictional account of the 1621 feast in her book Standish on Standish, A Story of the Pilgrims. In any case, over the course of the 19th century, Thanksgiving turkeys became the thing to eat on Thanksgiving. Bickham explains. One reason for this, a roasted turkey makes a perfect celebratory centerpiece. The second one is that turkey is also practical for serving to a large crowd. In 2015, food historian Emily Rood recalled a nearly forgotten bit of turkey tradition in Time magazine. Many have been the tales of the great cattle drives. Hardly anybody remembers the great turkey walks, recounts author Kathleen Carr in her book The Great Turkey Walk. And indeed, in antebellum America, a parade of thousands of turkeys gobbling their way down country roads to urban markets was a regular sight in the weeks before Thanksgiving. Vermont turkeys hiked their way to Boston, Kentucky, and Tennessee turkeys marched proudly into Richmond, and some western birds even found themselves driven the thousands of miles between Missouri and Colorado. Rood notes the tradition carried on in the U.S. well into the 1930s in some regions. While turkeys ride to market now by truck, the tradition lives on in Thanksgiving time charity walks and runs, which are commonly called turkey trots. It was the 1863 celebration that created the foundation for another tradition, WhiteHouse.gov explains. During the Civil War, Tad Lincoln asked his father to spare a turkey named Jack from a holiday meal. President Abraham Lincoln obliged his son and pardoned the fortunate turkey. When in 1947 the National Turkey Federation began the tradition of presenting a live turkey to the President of the United States, the popular story is that President Truman restarted the tradition of the president officially pardoning a turkey. And of course, the popular story is incorrect. A November 2007 edition of the Washington Post writes that the photos of Truman pardoning his turkeys looked real enough. Live turkey, live prez, grandly extending his hand towards the Tom's waddle in a gesture that surely said emancipation, liberation, freedom. Except, it didn't. Instead, the Post writes, the archivists at Truman Presidential Library say that what Truman was doing in the photo was receiving a turkey. The Poultry Board gave Truman turkeys every year, and we think they probably ended up on the dinner table. President Eisenhower likewise, the Post argues, ate his turkeys. The Post explains that John F. Kennedy casually spared a turkey on November 19, 1963, just days before his assassination. When given a bird wearing a sign reading, "Good eatin', Mr. President," Kennedy said, "Let's just keep him." But it wasn't an official pardon, says Kennedy archivist Steve Plotkin. It was probably offhand and purely spontaneous. Thereafter, the national turkeys were commonly sent to petting zoos rather than to the dinner table, but in possibly another example of the Mandela effect, there were no official presidential pardons until WhiteHouseHistory.org explains the formalities of pardoning a turkey gelled by 1989, when President George H.W. Bush, with animal rights activists picketing nearby, quipped, "But let me assure you, in this fine Tom turkey, that he will not end up on anyone's dinner table. Not this guy. He's granted a presidential pardon as of right now." The tradition has been carried on since then. This year, President Biden pardoned turkeys named Liberty and Belle. Sadly, however, turkeys are not bred for long lives. The National Turkey Federation estimates that a pardoned bird will be lucky to live 2 years after it's saved by the president. Oddly, for their popularity, the word turkey has a negative connotation, especially when applied to an unsuccessful play or film. Harold Meyerson, editor-at-large of the news organization The American Prospect, explained in 2019 that this was derived from the early 20th century, when tourists would crowd New York during the holiday season. Accordingly, a very large number of shows opened every year in November, and even if they only stuck around until shortly after New Year, they were usually able to turn a profit, provided that the house had been reasonably full. What that meant was that an awful lot of awful shows opened up every year around Thanksgiving, and the critics at Variety, who were obligated to attend and review every one of them, took to calling those shows turkeys, and the term stuck. And Broadway shows aren't the only places where turkeys struggle. Columnist Michael Morgan noted in a 2020 edition of the Salisbury, Delaware Daily Times that during World Wars I and II, holiday turkey shortages occurred due to shortages of feed and demands of the military. In some areas, he writes, the shortage was particularly acute. On the East Coast, less than half the turkeys needed for the traditional Thanksgiving feast were available. There was a similar, if not as acute, problem in 2022, when the supply was heavily impacted by an avian flu outbreak. Perhaps the greatest challenges, however, have come to the original, wild version of the turkey. A bulletin of the National Wild Turkey Federation notes that as the settlers tamed the wilderness, cleared the woodlands, and pushed westward, fewer wild turkeys were left behind. Connecticut had lost its wild turkeys by 1813. Vermont held out until 1842, and other states followed. By 1920, the wild turkey was lost from 18 of the original 39 states and Ontario, Canada, in its supposed ancestral range. The 5 subspecies of wild turkeys in the United States probably declined to their lowest numbers in the late 1930s. According to data collected by Henry S. Mosby, in 1937, the wild turkey was in trouble, although conservation efforts after the Second World War have returned huntable populations in most states. And while some 46 million turkeys will grace our holiday tables this Thanksgiving, the National Turkey Federation notes that turkey is no longer seen as just a holiday market, but as a low-fat staple for health-conscious consumers. And because of that, turkey consumption per capita in the United States has nearly doubled since 1970 to 15.3 pounds per person per year. But oddly, for a food that seems so quintessentially American, the United States is only third internationally in per capita turkey consumption, behind Israel and Hungary. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.